So excited to be having this conversation with you today. I want to take us back to 1954.
Okay.
Brown v. Board was just decided by the United States Supreme Court. Schools are desegregated. But what impacts did Brown v. Board have on American society other than just a general desegregation from the landmark decision?
So 1954 is the end of really one period in American life and the beginning of another, which is to say from 1896 to 1954, the idea of separate but equal was actually written into not only the Constitution as determined by the Supreme Court, but into day-to-day practices. I was born in 1955 in Virginia, and so I was often said I was born just in time for the second Brown decision, where the phrase all deliberate speed was introduced into the American vocabulary. But with that decision in 1954, the whole question of how we think about equal opportunity for all Americans, and particularly how we use and position the question of race in American life, really came to the fore. And for some, that was a scary proposition, because for at least two, if not three generations, there was an assumption that you could tell not only black from white, but you could separate black from white. The Supreme Court in '54 actually upended that logic, and that changed things.
But as we know, just because it upended that logic with one decision doesn't mean it actually changed minds, right? Because society is society still. And so in the years after '54, how did the pushback to Brown v. Board, to the major decision, impact the movement as a whole?
So I would say that if you think about the '54 decision saying that separate but equal is unconstitutional, the '55 decision, Brown 2, which said schools should desegregate with all deliberate speed, the first phase of the pushback was almost immediate. It was 1957 and '58 and '59, you began to see something called massive resistance across the South, where legislatures from Virginia all the way down to Mississippi into Texas ended up writing and determining that, look, we can actually thwart this effort by essentially saying we're not going to observe the law. That was the first phase. And so if you think of it, schools in the South didn't actually really fully desegregate until 1970. It was actually 15 years after the second Brown decision that black and white students went to school on equal terms in much of the South. I know because I lived it. I was a part of what I refer to as the transitional generation. We were kids who actually came of age in the mid-1950s, but went to segregated schools until we were in the 9th or 10th grade. And so when we think of what the impact was, there was immediate impact because schools were closed across the South rather than desegregate. There was violence. There were ways of actually pushing back. And then you get this period from about 1970 through 1976, where there was really frontal assault on trying to say, okay, if we're going to desegregate, let's do it. And maybe desegregation could lead to integration, where you actually share power. Desegregation says you eliminate barriers. Integration suggested something about sharing power. And then the courts began to pull back a little bit again with the Bakke decision by '78, and you began to say, okay, that in an interesting kind of way of timeline, and then you get a whole another chapter after 1978 as we move back and forth in the nation over how to really share all of the fruits of labor in the country.
Well, I guess shifting 70 years later, what impact does Brown v. Board have today and this entire movement? Because we're still, in a way, we're kind of seeing society move backwards now.
Yeah, no, I mean, but you realize that those who have opposed Brown played the long game, right? They've actually been at this for 50, 60, 70 years. There were efforts in the 1970s in places like Boston and in my native home of Norfolk, Virginia, where there was a group called Save Our Neighborhood Schools. I mean, it's this idea that neighborhood school was the way about, and so people have always had some consternation, if not indigestion, over what it meant, but to desegregate. But you know, part of it is how you see is the glass fully half full or half empty, and it really is this fascinating way of explaining American history and American life to say, yeah, if you, from the vantage point of 25, 26, we can say things are tough. But if you're looking from 2010 to 25, 26, you can also see moments of hope. I mean, in that period when Barack Obama gets elected, there's this moment of hope. I can still see, and you may have seen the images, there's this picture of Jesse Jackson with a tear streaming down his cheek after Obama is standing there in a square in Chicago, and he represents what it meant to have been in the civil rights movement and struggled, and recognizing both his triumphs and failures as a leader. But here was a new generation who came to the fore. So starting in 2020, you sort of think about the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. It was a moment of reckoning. And people across the country took to the streets to say, this is not us. This is not who we want. It's not who we want to be. Now you juxtapose that to the march on the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, or the shooting in a church in South Carolina, or the massacre in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. I mean, there are moments when you say, well, both of those things are who we are. I mean, there is this period where we've always been, in some ways, a conflict of visions over what version of America is going to play out. But that's, for me, the hopeful part, that there's a conflict of visions rather than a single vision.
What do you say to someone my age? I'm 26 years old, growing up in this kind of new environment that we're living through. We just saw the Supreme Court roll back affirmative action almost completely. A lot of people say that we are entering a dark time in our country. What do you say to the average 26-year-old? Where can they find hope in this moment?
I would say, and I teach some of those 26-year-olds still at the University of Michigan these days, and I say, what you're reminded of by particularly paying attention to American history is that individuals at individual times in the past have really come to believe they can be the architects of their own history. And so part of the challenge, if you think there's a dark moment and you want to bring light, then your job is to actually turn on the switch and bring that light. You can't stand by the sidelines and believe someone else is going to do it. So part of it is to remind yourself that when you read about these individuals in the history books, they were the ones who actually were turning on the switch, to turn the light, to actually create a better world. It's now your turn to deal with the light and the switch.
And now, my final question for you is, the 70 years since Brown v. Board, I want to take us to the next 70 years. Yeah. What lessons should my generation learn in terms of community building, in terms of fighting racial inequities? What should we learn and what should we take away from the past 70 years moving forward?
There are three things I think that anyone should take from the last 70 years. One is that this is not just a series of moments. There's a long arc here. And that even as you can measure progress and you actually want to work toward progress, others are actually uncomfortable with that progress. And so they're going to be working in parallel to thwart some of the things that you are about. And so don't become overly optimistic or overly despairing about the moment, recognizing that what the last 70 years tells you is all work. And that as you look ahead, then part of what you have to look for is what are the strategies and what are the tactics that you need to do individually in individual groups, but also in broad, so cross-sectional groups to actually create a really full democracy. I mean, I'm sitting here in a place like Boston, and you're reminded that the framers coming out of the American Revolution didn't know what this new republic would become, but they had a vision of what this republic could become, even though they were flawed in their own times. We get, and this is what we learned from the second part from the last 70 years, you get to actually rewrite the script. And so part of trying to figure out how do you want to be an author of the rewriting of that script. And the last part of it is that you should be energized. Because if you look at the last 70 years, people gave a lot, but they didn't give up. And I spent some time with a guy that you may read about in the history books, Bernard Lafayette. He was a close lieutenant of MLK Jr. And Bernard used to say to me, he says, "Earl, the historians get it all wrong all the time." And I go, "What do you mean we get it all wrong, Bernard?" He goes, "You guys come in and you sort of see these flash moments, and we talk about Birmingham and we talk about Selma and we talk." He says, but we were strategists every day of the week, every month of the year, every year throughout. We were planning for a future, and we were strategists and we were tacticians. And so part of this third piece I would say is that it requires you to remember that people in the past were strategists and tacticians. Your job is actually to learn from those strategies and tactics, but also to improve upon them.
Dr. Lewis, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.